to be with us today. And she's been with us throughout the preparations and planning of this workshop. I'm so glad. Welcome, Dr. Janaki. Today's session is being moderated by Dr. Minnie Thomas. She's a faculty member of the department here. Over to you, Minnie, to conduct the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva. Thank you. We have a very, good afternoon to all and a very, very warm welcome to the 12th lecture of our international workshop. Our speaker is none other than eminent historian and Professor Janaki Nair. I welcome Professor and all our distinguished delegates participating through this webinar, of course. And it is, I have lots to say about you, Professor, because we have been reading continually about you, but I will leave that to Jacinta, who is our master student, to introduce our eminent historian for the evening. Thank you. Over to you, Jacinta.
Good evening to all. Welcome to the 12th lecture of the international webinar named by Thinking Utopian Spaces Historically on Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches, hosted by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, with the financial assistance of the Kerala Council for Historical Research. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome the distinguished speaker, Dr. Janaki Nair, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. Janaki Nair was a professor of modern history at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She did her PhD at Syracuse University, New York. Her research interests include social, political, and cultural history of Mysore or Karnataka, legal history, urban history, feminism, and visual culture. She was awarded the New Foundation Book Prize in 2005 for the promise of Metropolis Bangalore's 20th century. She is also a recipient of Prince Claude Fund Fellowship, Netherlands, Cephas Fellowship, Netherlands, and John Savile Award, UK. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Pembroke Centre, Brown University. Her publications include Mysore Modern, Reconceptualizing the Region Under Princely Rule, Minas and Milhan's Work, Culture and Politics in Princely Mysore, Women and Law in Colonial India, A Social History, and other edited works and papers. Welcome, ma'am. A warm welcome to all the participants to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And let me start by saying a very big thank you to Shiva for inviting me to be part of this very, very important series. I think in these times, it is very interesting to see the kinds of lectures and series that are being put together. And I'm particularly happy that this has happened in a university in Kerala. And I'm really delighted to be a part of this series. Let me start with a word of warning, as it were, because I know that the other speakers in the series have more or less focused on the concept notes that Shiva had circulated and have addressed more directly the question of the archives. I'm not going to do that so much in this talk. The archive will come in a very marginal sort of way, and you will see why. And I thought that this is something that I would like to talk about, which has emerged out of my many years, decades, I should say, of teaching a course on the modern city and its predicaments and possibilities. So I'll start right away. I have a prepared text. As and when necessary, I will also speak and show you these slides that I have put together for this talk. Towards the end of his book, Good City Form, Kevin Lynch, the perceptive explorer and planner of urban form, spoke of the difficulty of imagining a desirable new society in a desirable physical setting, given the customary disconnect between those who imagined social utopias and those who designed physical ones. He then made this very important and compelling observation that only in, and I'm quoting now, only in anti-utopias can we find examples where physical oppression abets social oppression in a very direct and circumstantial way. Hell, at least, is vivid and convincing. And he gives this example of having set some schoolboys a task of illustrating hell, and they did it with obvious glee. They didn't show the same glee in illustrating Utopia, knowing full well that his own recital of wishes, as he calls it, at the end of the book is woefully inadequate, even impractical. He nevertheless says that wishing is a way of finding out and of communicating, one method of learning how to act in the present. Utopian thinking is, as Frederick Jameson also put it, not so much the task of creating radical alternatives to existing societies, but, quote, the imperative to imagine them. My talk today takes heart from this suggestion that rethinking space and social relations, spaces and relations that might not yet or never exist, might help us in reaching beyond our dystopic present to fantasize about the good and virtuous city. We cannot deny, in the Indian subcontinent at least, our cities are indeed closer to Dante's Inferno than to any idyllic urban countryside. And there is a small cottage industry of writing that has developed over the last 30 years on the monumental failures of planning. So I return to ideas rooted in more than a century of restless experimentation with forms that combine the best of town and country to those historical thoughts and experiments, some of which did not even materialize, in order chiefly to ask questions about the resources with which these thinkers imagined new beginnings, and to what extent the experiences, the urban forms of the past, and indeed also their repudiation, structured the way in which the future was thought. Now, as I said to you at the very outset, my interest in reveries and fantasies from elsewhere and from afar arises out of a relatively significant silence that I have discovered over many years of teaching courses on the history of the modern city. The severe dearth of dreams about good city form and the links between built forms and new civic virtues in the subcontinent. This is not, and I should point out, particularly in a series like this, which is focused on the question of archives, this is not merely an archival silence. It is not just that we don't have the materials from which to reconstruct what we know has existed, but it is a historical absence, since it appears that while there were any number of people engaged in imagining literary and social utopias, think, for example, of Rokeya Shakawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream, ideas of redesigned space to invoke new ideas of equality and freedom, or a resetting of the most egregious of social relations, which in our context, of course, is related to caste and gender relations, were few and far between. It was, as we know, the squalor and the horrors of the city of the dreadful night, that is to say, the Victorian industrial city, urban space, to forge social relations anew, to strive for a new beginning. As the well-known historian of the city, Lewis Mumford, has famously said, the disease produced its own antibodies in the form of urban planning. The Victorian city had many lessons to teach, he says, but for the urbanists, the chief lesson was what to avoid. But it was not only the brutalizing effects of industrialization on the cities, but also the enormous resources generated by industrial capitalism and the new possibilities for universal well-being that opened up in terms of materials and skills and simply unparalleled wealth and abundance. It was on these bases that the new future was imagined. So in this talk, I'll first begin by briefly discussing the chief lineaments of the more well-known utopian imaginings taken from Europe and America, and the extent to which history or the past was at all a resource in such fantasies. While many of these ideas and schemes are usually folded into histories of planning, of urban planning, that is, I focus on their interest not merely in solving the intractable problems of the industrial city or in managing them, but in resetting human relations, generating new civic virtues, producing well-being for all. For them, the city was not merely an arrangement of roads, buildings, spaces, not simply a form, but a process which shaped as much as it was shaped by people's actions and desires. So in that sense, I am distinguishing the history of urban planning from the utopian ideals that might have animated it. I then return to my inaugural observation by interrogating the relative silence on utopian spaces in our subcontinent before concluding with some speculations on whether we can generate a new set of questions that will unlock new archives, uncover those brief and illuminating moments in our past or present that give us a glimpse of possible utopian urban futures. And I must say at the outset that there is a bit of mismatch in this presentation because I will be proceeding from very well documented and studied cases and moments to the realm of speculation and about conditions of possibility, impossibility, where I will be indulging more in provocation than in any well fleshed out argument. Okay, so let's begin right away to talk about utopias and dystopias and the range of responses that were generated, particularly in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. From the outset, thoughts about and the design of utopian spaces inaugurated in Thomas More's inaugural text, also called Utopia, were visions that were rooted in deeply moral and ethical questions about the inequities and the savage hierarchies of the contemporary. By the 19th century, with the onset of industrial capitalism, there was growing consternation, even among, and this is important for us to understand, there was consternation even among members of the industrial bourgeoisie about the primeval ooze of the industrial city and the specters of criminality, deteriorating family ties, appalling standards of sanitation and health, and the restlessness of the working poor that could lead to public political conflagrations that threatened civic order. This was what it was that prompted these new imaginings. But within the rubric of imagining, nothing less than the well-being of the new human being was being thought. So what were the kinds of resources on which these thinkers drew? Clearly, and I want to just say this here as a sort of a throwaway sentence, but you will see that it is actually well supported with evidence, which I may not be able to provide in the space of this lecture. Clearly, the fact that the largest number and the most varied utopian communities came up in America reveals that the burdens imposed by a long past, as in Europe, and inherited structures were quite severe for imagining new futures. There were some common elements that bound the 19th century utopians. First, I'll just sort of enumerate them with a few points. First, there was a desire to recast the relationship between town and country from one of exploitative antagonism to one of cooperation, to heal, as it were, the radical estrangement between humans and nature. For instance, the industrialist Robert Owen, who took over the mills at Lanark in Scotland from his father-in-law, saw, now why is this not working? Sorry. Let me just get the PowerPoint. Yep. Yeah. Okay, right, thank you. For instance, the industrialist Robert Owen, who took over the mills at Lanark from his father-in-law, saw nothing but disorder, distrust, disunion all around him, and wanted to restore harmony, confidence, regularity. What he established at New Lanark between 1800 and 1825 was a model working community of 1,300 people and 500 orphans from Ireland and Scotland, an experiment in utopian socialism that actually utilized the enormous resources and profits that had been generated by capitalism. And he was therefore himself putting money into this project for the welfare and happiness of all. New Lanark was a community of producers, forging a link with the countryside as the resource for meeting material, spiritual, and aesthetic needs. There was also the belief in the wholesome quality of rural values, of cooperation and harmony, rather than fierce competition and rugged individualism. This link between town and country was something that many utopian thinkers would focus on, trying to restore, as it were, the harmony between town and country, which they felt had been severely ruptured by industrialization. And this continues actually well into the 20th century, even in the imaginings of somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1930s. Despite the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright was actually dedicated to the automobile, there was a call to return to nature, to combine agriculture and industry. But having said that, I must immediately clarify that New Lanark was not anti-industrial. Rather, industry was given its rightful place as much as it was in Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. Quite unlike William Morris's News from Nowhere. Now, this is, of course, a literary text which spoke of a backward-looking world focused on a small, balanced, ordered community. The most well-known of the resolutions in the 19th century of the town-country antithesis was the concept of the garden city, to which some of you may be familiar with, founded by Ebenezer Howard, who imagined smokeless, scumless cities in tune with nature. And I'm just quoting one little paragraph from him. I won't read it out, but you can read it as you wish, taken from his 1898 book called The Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Ideally, it was the acquisition of agricultural property for community use. And he had very useful and important diagrammatic representations. I'm wondering if you can see this well enough, but this is his famous image of the three magnets, in which he proposed that the garden city combines the best elements of the city with those best elements of the countryside to provide, as it were, a good town-country balance. And each of these elements that he described, both the negative and the positive elements of both the town and country, were actually quite important, because he was certainly not rejecting the town as something that was to be avoided or minimized in his scheme of things. He also envisaged that the profits of this community would flow back into the community itself. So it was a way of getting rid of landlords and their pernicious practices, promoting instead communally owned land. And here I show you yet again an image which actually sort of is a prescriptive image for a garden city, and a third image which also shows you a portion of the garden city plan. Now, was the garden city producing the sterile anti-urbanism of the suburbs? Not really, because Howard's goal was not the industrialist middle-class garden suburb that the two garden cities, Welwyn and Letchworth, finally became. In fact, if I can show you some images of Welwyn City, this is, of course, idyllic, a couple having their lunch by the sunlit window and the child who's at play outside looking in. In fact, both Letchworth and Welwyn did become, as it were, garden suburbs rather than garden cities. So if I can show you yet another image of Welwyn Garden City, very placid and calm, and certainly no trace of industry here. But this was not his ideal. His ideal was the higher and better form of industrial life throughout the country. So dispersing industry rather than concentrating it in the overcrowded, dense, dark Victorian city. This dispersal would also ensure that everyone was an entrepreneur, contributing his or her skills to the development of a sustainable and wholesome community. But needless to say, these were not ideals which were easy to translate into practice. And you have both Letchworth and Welwyn turning into, as it were, garden suburbs rather than full-fledged garden cities. By definition, in order to achieve the symbiosis between city and country, the utopian city had to be dramatically scaled down in size, as against the purposeless mass congestion of the metropolis. Utopian cities could be endlessly multiplied, but each could consist of no more than a few thousand inhabitants. For instance, Charles Fourier's plans were for his phalansteries, which were like hermetic enclaves set in nature. So each of the phalansteries were to have just 1,620 people each. And this was a very well-planned kind of utopian space. Because he proposed this phalanstery as a material shell for his utopia, a single large multi-story building housing all activities of the colony, set, however, within a rich farming region. And of course, as you can see, it has symmetrical wings and arcades, almost like a palace. But I'm using this image here only to demonstrate that, he, like the other utopians of the early 19th century and the late 19th century, had very clear ideas on an optimum number who could live in one such phalanstery. Ebenezer Howard's plans, on the other hand, were to house 32,000 people, but on 1,000 acres. So that's a mere 32 persons per acre. So it's a very expansive kind of ideal that is being set out, sparsely populated rather than densely populated. Above all, as thinkers from Fourier to Frank Lloyd Wright would point out, the small size of the utopian settlement reduced the time wasted in traveling to and from work, saving time and energy for more fruitful and enjoyable activities. So the second point that I would like to draw from these examples of the 19th century was their focus on making work pleasurable. Most of these 19th century thinkers were also recasting ideas of work. Meaningful work was to be freed from the mind-numbing, repetitive, monotonous, and tediously long working day in the industrial workplace. Owen had insisted on an 8-hour day. 8 hours labor, 8 hours rest, 8 hours recreation. Remember, this is the time when the 15 to 16-hour working day was the norm. And he tried to implement this in his own factories. He built airy buildings, emphasized an education that included compulsory dancing and singing, and attempted to organize social events in his house that would include the laboring classes. This was his way of undermining the hierarchies that he believed were very detrimental to the new society that he was imagining. It's another matter that his disappointments in New Lanark led him to leave from the US in 1825 and start afresh a community called New Harmony, for which he found almost 30,000 acres of fresh, utilized land. Unfortunately, that experiment also failed, and he was soon back in England just a few years later. Charles Fourier went further in insisting that people must do work that is suited to their temperaments in short sessions, which will allow them to do what he called 7 or 8 attractive tasks in a day. Each worker, he argued, must be compensated by dividends, not by wages. And men and women were to work in amicable groups, doing, as I said, several different kinds of tasks every day. Frank Lloyd Wright in the 20th century also imagined workers living on the factory roofs while also having access to land and the pleasures of cultivation of food for their own needs. So this was an imagination of work that is pleasurable, enjoyable, creative, and productive, not just something which you idle away time on, but rather that it is productive as well. So this recasting of work to make it more enjoyable, creative, and rewarding, and not just in terms of wages, became rather muted. This is interesting to note because this ideal becomes somewhat muted in the writings of Ebenezer Howard and Le Corbusier. In fact, Corbusier unquestioningly accepted the 8-hour shift and its monotony as a form of heroism and pride of which workers were, according to him, fully aware. For him, the central dilemma facing the architect was what the worker will make of the 16 hours of non-work time in surroundings that to him were less than conducive to living. And I'll come to Le Corbusier just a little later. But I'm suggesting to you that not all the utopian thinkers were necessarily going to make proposals about the reorganization of work. That was the concern of at least a few of the ones I have already mentioned. This brings us to the third element of these utopian dreams, a focus on the necessity of beauty, which was most evident in the writings of communitarian thinkers like William Morris and Camillo Zitter. And it also engaged the utopians from Robert Owen to Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. It's another matter that everybody had a very different conception of and definition of what it is to produce beauty. As we have seen from the images, Fourier's phalansteries, and that term, by the way, the phalanstery is taken from an ironic sort of mixture of the term phalange, which is body of troops in movement, and monastery. So it's an odd kind of mixture indeed that he dreamed up. This central building with 2 phalanges, you can see this in the image here, in which small communities of people would work cooperatively with specifically designated spaces for specific age-appropriate functions. But as you can see in this design, there was no harking back, there was no nostalgia for the ornamentations of the past. That nostalgia for, and this is another image of Charles Fourier's phalanstery, which is giving you details on the kinds of activities that can be undertaken in each part of this vast building. But there were people like Camillo Zitter, who wrote this book called City Planning According to Artistic Principles, who critiques the modern city for its ugliness. I'm not including him really amongst the utopian thinkers. He was, of course, an urban planner, and he had very, very strong and very persuasive views on the idea of beauty. I'm only using him as the foil against which one discusses the utopian thinkers themselves, because here was somebody who critiqued the modern city for its ugliness, and his redressal of the problem of ugliness took directly from the past. He wanted to recreate the best elements of the medieval city. His effort was, that is to say, the medieval European city. His effort was, above all, to demonstrate that the requirements of the modern city, that is to say, ease of passage, transport, health, and sanitation, were not necessarily in conflict with the practice of art. So his idea, his interest was to actually combine what might be modern convenience with the principles of artistic beauty. And for him, the gridiron form was not only dull, it was positively dangerous. Street design, according to him, in the modern city was somehow subordinated to the demands of traffic, whereas the artistic city could, in fact, be envisaged, as you can see in this quotation, as something that gives you not just visual pleasures as you turn through these winding zigzag streets. So to him, the medieval European town of this kind was probably the most attractive city. It did not have the regular right-angled streets of the modern city. It was the pictoriality of the city that was his goal, although comfort was also important. So he privileged, as it were, the sudden looming into view as you turned the corner of a narrow street, of something rather beautiful like a clock tower or a bridge or simply another kind of building. Therefore, to him, the irregularities of terrain, the existing waterways and roads, etc., should not be forcibly eliminated in the modern city simply in order to achieve this banal rectangularity, but instead should be preserved as a welcome excuse for crooked streets and other diversities. I'm, of course, citing from him here. But this was a rather extreme position, and certainly not one that was espoused by most of our utopian thinkers. Howard, for example, thought that beauty was already available to people in England in the form of parks and open spaces, but those spaces had to be administered in the real interests of the community rather than remaining privately owned. And he said, and I quote, "There are in the country beautiful vistas, lordly parks, violet-scented woods, sounds of rippling water, but too often one sees those threatening words, 'Trespassers will be prosecuted.'" Beauty was taken directly, in his case, from nature and its cleansing ability, the promise of easy access to fields and parks, sunny skies, fresh air, and all that had become, as it were, a rare commodity in the jerry-built slums of the Victorian city. All these were actually available, except that they had to be now taken out of some kind of private ownership and brought back to the community as a community resource. This was his idea of what was beautiful and needed to be restored. Fourth was and this is an important aspect of the utopian imaginings, a resetting of hierarchies, and especially here of gender hierarchies. Now, this idea of resetting gender hierarchies had found some space even within the imaginings of somebody like Robert Owen at the beginning of the 19th century in the form of collective kitchens, which were experimented with in New Harmony, which was his project in the United States between 1925 and 1928. But they did not go as far as Fourier's ideas. Fourier, for instance, believed in the release from the indignities and deceits of bourgeois marriage of both men and women. He saw the necessity of organizing space within the phalanstery to liberate sexual passions among the young and among men and among women as much as men, yielding space to an infinite human capacity for joy. No doubt the phalanstery was as much an unnatural arrangement, as we have seen from the images I have shown you, as the systems that it wished to replace, though its break with precedent was actually quite significant. The inhabitants of his new community, harmony was what he called it. Of course, Fourier's communities were actually never built, were to engage in free love, since he believed that it was the unnatural set of institutions and codes known as civilization. So it was a critique of Western civilization as he had experienced it until then that had led to repressing humans. Now, neither Ebenezer Howard nor Corbusier were as ambitious in recasting family life and the place of women in it. In fact, as I have already hinted to you, Corbusier's heroic male had to be enabled to participate in the patriarchally organized household without disturbance. And we'll see a little bit more of this shortly. The challenge to gender hierarchies and the radical reorganization of domestic and public space to ensure women more freedom reached its epitome in the work of feminist utopians, who, by the way, are usually ignored in these catalogs of utopian thinkers. Those who reconceptualized domestic life and space aimed to reduce the repetitive drudgeries of household labor. For example, it was quite rightly asked who wished to approximately produce 1,095 meals per year, in addition to planning and cleaning up after that. As Dolores Hayden tells us, the dream of collective domestic labor had animated conversations of US communitarians for several decades, before the mid-19th century when they reached their full flowering. So the answer of some utopian planners in the US, I'm sorry. Such as Marie Holland in the 1870s, 1880s, and Alice Constance Austin in the 1890s to the 1910s, who designed an entire city in California, was to socialize domestic work, collectivize laundry, cooking, and childcare. This was part of a feminist legacy that deplored husband-wife relations as much as they deplored master-servant relations. And you can see from this design here that these are kitchenless households, common kitchens to which there would be passage. In the case of Alice Constance Austin, the passages were actually underground. And remember, all this is well before the Soviet Union of the 1920s, where the family itself was expected to wither away as an institution until Stalin ensured that this did not happen. Now, this involved the design of kitchenless houses, though food consumption still remained a privatized affair. Freeing women for a more public life was only an implicit goal, since the designs did not necessarily reset gender relations or, interestingly, did not assign a greater role for men in domestic life. Women remained principally housewives, though with fewer responsibilities. Some thinkers, and this included some women, I should point out, abhorred those women who were looking for a career outside the home. Let us remember that even the left-oriented Bauhaus architects of the early 20th century aimed for greater efficiency in housework by deploying the principles of scientific management to increase the efficiency of the household through the use of more domestic appliances, but only in order to free women for their roles as spouses and mothers. I'll show you, one or two more slides of the kitchenless home that Alice Constance Austin designed and is discussing with colonist Svetlana Del Rio in California in the early 20th century. This again was a plan that never materialized, but nevertheless had thought in detail about the ways in which women could be relieved from domestic, from the chores, from the grinding sort of monotony of domestic labor. If utopian schemes began failing at the very moment of their materialization, it was partly since they called forth a paternalistic authoritarianism. For instance, central to Owen's idea was education and its role in the formation of character. And he actually founded a new institution for the formation of character. And to him, quote, dancing, music, and military discipline, conducted on the principles of charity and kindness to all humankind, were among the best and most powerful surroundings for forming a good and happy character. And these were necessary elements to introduce in these utopian communities. Now you can see by the kinds of the mixed emphasis on happiness, joy, and also military discipline, that there was a certain kind of authoritarianism, a patriarchal authority, paternalistic authoritarianism, no doubt, but nevertheless authoritarianism, quite recognizably so. Now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels respectfully rejected the utopian socialists because they felt that they had failed to understand the productive power of industrialization and were grounded in a moral critique of the inequalities of existing society and an ethical projection of a new social moral order. Of course, despite many promising starts, the expected revolution did not materialize. But by the 20th century, there were clearly new visions of the city that were driven precisely by the productive power of industrialization. And who better illustrates this than Le Corbusier? Now, Le Corbusier, as you know, made a very important break with all his 19th century forebears. He dominates this vision of the new city, showing contempt for what he described as the way of the pack donkey. And you can see the contempt with which he describes the pack donkey and the pack donkey's path as defining the space of the old European cities, including places like Barcelona, Rome, and Istanbul in his list of places. He shuddered at the thought of history as a resource for rethinking the space of the city. In fact, his forebear might have been somebody like Otto Wagner, who was designing in Vienna an architecture of Adam, naked and strong, though I'm sure, if I can just be a little facetious here, no Gaul will admit to this Teutonic legacy. But still, since the industrial cities of the 20th century were destined to be centers of high density, it was the obligation of the planner or the dreamer to plan accordingly, exploiting the new materials and their strength to the maximum. The dream of dense and high-rise cities grouped around large communally shared spaces, frontally attacked, and I don't have time to go into this question here, frontally attacked the street and its vitality, as it were. So in his vision, as you can see, the Radiant City here, 1930, his plan was set for Paris of 1925, and his planning for exact air, as he called it, in 1930. All of these are almost inhuman in their conception because they are imagining housing up to 3 million inhabitants. That's the future of the city, and that's what we should be actually planning to house in this better way than what the industrial city had actually achieved. Le Corbusier's concern was with the home as a machine. Neither the artisan nor the intellectual had the homes adequate to their needs and desires. The industrial workplace was, in his view, clean and productive. The home was an anachronism, a throwback to a different era. Therefore, it could not remain a snail shell. I'm quoting from his own work towards a new architecture. It could not remain a snail shell full of tuberculosis, and instead had to be made a machine to live in. Itself a thing of beauty, and let's not forget he had his own definition of what the aesthetics of this form would be. Itself a thing of beauty in its regenerative productiveness. We must, and you can see here, what is the man going to do? And I quote, what is the man going to do with his freedom from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m.? That is to say, if you have an 8-hour shift, you're left alone for 16 hours. From 2 a.m. till night, what becomes of the family under these conditions? And as you can see, he's not particularly interested in resetting gender relations here. All that was at the center of his imagination was, of course, the heroic male worker. The lodging, he said, is hideous, and the worker is not educated enough to make something of this leisure. Towards this, and you can see his statement here, we must create the mass production spirit, the spirit of constructing mass production houses, the spirit of conceiving mass production houses, and we will arrive at the house machine, which will be beautiful in the way that the working tools and instruments which accompany our existence are beautiful. Now, this is obviously a very, very significant departure from perhaps some of the nostalgic longings of the 19th century imagination. And you can see that he has also made a very, very powerful impact on on those who designed cities after him. Most notably Brasilia, but again, we don't have time here to go into that example. If Le Corbusier talked of the concentration of cities, Frank Lloyd Wright, building on the legacies of the 19th century utopians, was concerned with its dispersal, centered, however, on the car as an instrument of freedom. So now, if you will excuse me, I have to let the dog out because she will otherwise disrupt this presentation. So please give me a moment.
Nemesis.
these are some of the perils of the Zoom lecture, and I'm very, very sorry for that interruption. If Le Corbusier talked of the concentration of cities, Frank Lloyd Wright was quite different because he was building on the legacies of the 19th century utopians, and he was concerned with its dispersal, with the dispersal of the city. However, as I said, centered on the car as an instrument of freedom. As he is reported to have said, the city should be everywhere and nowhere. And you can see the only element of the city in this broadacre city, unbuilt, of course, designed in 1932, is this very tall structure in the background. Broadacre city, designed in 1932 but never built, combined a decentralized suburban plan with a certain kind of new Jeffersonian conception of self-sufficiency and small-scale production. Every family would own at least one car, and concentrated urban areas would cease to exist. Distance would be annihilated by the speed and autonomy of the automobile. Each household was allotted 1 acre for home production, and many others would work from home. So this work from home concept, with which we are now becoming increasingly familiar, was also something that he had perhaps thought of as a liberating option in the time that he designed Broadacre City. Now, what I've taken you through today is a very small sample of the ways in which built forms were shaped or could shape human life, and how they were imagined in the 19th and the 20th centuries. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, my own interest in this history has arisen from many years of teaching a course on the modern city and its perils and hopes. It has also arisen out of a certain curiosity, unfulfilled thus far, and I have to mention this in the hope that somebody in today's audience will be vigorously contradicting what I am about to say. What accounts for the lack of imaginative interest in producing city spaces appropriate to our own problems and aspirations? Even the founding editorial of the Modern Architectural Research Group in the first issue of the iconic journal, what would become the iconic journal Marg, in 1946, in which he equated planning with dreaming, Mulkraj Anand posed the familiar tension between an uncritical return to the past and its resources and a slavish loyalty to the achievements of the West. It seemed like one was trapped in this kind of dilemma of choosing between our own rich but very problematic past and the compulsions of imitating what had happened in the West. However, and this is significant, he called for shedding the dust of centuries and firmly rejected any commitment to past models as a panacea for the predicaments of the present. He called instead for a love of the future equal to the love of the past. And I quote, a wise, sane future in which we can build up a new living tradition, end quote. That optimism, as we well know from the continued festering state of our cities, was belied over the past 75 or so years. And I'm here willfully avoiding reference to the design and construction of Navi Mumbai and Chandigarh or even Bhubaneswar, which planning histories routinely classify along with utopian imagination. It's not that we've had no imaginings and dreams of the iconic kind undertaken by Rabindranath Tagore in Shantiniketan, for example, although it was a ruralized folk memory infused with classicism, which exerted the greatest influence even there, with great aesthetic distinction, no doubt, in its construction. rather than the potentials of new materials such as steel and glass or methods of building and planning space. It was indeed to some uncorrupted core that Shantiniketan turned. Hence, those mud and bricks rather than, not usually cement, concrete that was used in these constructions. There was great optimism expressed in these structures of simplicity and, of course, a fierce commitment to beauty. But also there was a hope of recovering a certain pre-lapsarian innocence, uncluttered by the corrupting temptations of the present, or even striving towards self-sufficiency, as in Sriniketan. The idea that the modern must somehow announce its subordination of nature was clearly abhorrent to Tagore, like many of our 19th century thinkers as well, who wished to harmonize the relationship between human settlements and nature, rather than spell out a mastery of the environment. To that extent, despite his own rootedness in the city and its opportunities and hope, Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, despite what P.K. Datta has described as the inter-embeddedness of that vision, was marked by a certain William Morris-like anti-industrialism, a return to the craft folk ideal. Now, I'd like to just take another example, which is rooted in a very different context and aspiration, and that is the example of Auroville, a spiritual center of human unity, though again incorporating a rural self-containing vision. It emphasized self-control and the reduction of needs, which was quite interesting and important. It emphasized and encouraged ecological sustainability. And as its charter says, it was intended to be a never-ending learning process. Founded in 1968 as a city of dawn, it embodied the search for a truly international community and unity in the design of Roger Anger at the urging of the mother Mira Alfasa, though it housed and continues to house largely people from outside India, alongside some Indians. I'm told the Indian proportion of the population, which is today something a little over 2,000, is something like 40%. So well over half are people from other locations in the world. It was inspired by the lofty ideal of belonging to nobody in particular and to humanity as a whole, with its cashless economy and, of course, its very important and massive contribution to environmental self-sustainability in a very dry and inhospitable region. And also a commitment to a uniquely small-scale rural aesthetic. But it has remained an enclave, and it's a very disturbingly neo-colonial and somewhat parasitic enclave, which has, of course, been replete with clashes with the local village communities, which fringe Auroville, those who, in fact, had brought their skills and labor to the construction of the site. And in fact, Jessica Nanakal, who has written on these contradictions, has called it a new age mixture of socialism, biological evolutionism, and spirituality, though its remit is perhaps too large to succeed in any one of its goals and ideals. Now, I cite these two as somewhat exceptional because we really don't have that many examples to cite. Although a person like Malcolm Miles in his Utopian Reader has provided a very extremely useful, actually, compilation of and comment on utopias from different parts of the world. He also, in his book, includes movements and smaller settings in India, such as the Chipko movement, the Barefoot College of Rajasthan, etc. But I would still like to ask, what is it that blocks our imaginations, stops us from the restlessness, the madness, and the passion of those whom we have discussed so far, that will allow us to take a flying leap into another future? I'm not going to historicize this lack. I will leave that to the psychoanalysts. Yet we cannot deny that for the most part, India has remained imprisoned within received urban forms, going further in the direction of finessing and deepening those festering cleavages of caste, gender, ethnicity, rather than dreaming of overcoming them. We are all too familiar with the concept of the gated community, an Indian equivalent of the anti-urbanism of the suburb, where middle-class Indians have taken refuge from the intolerable strains of the contemporary Indian city. I would like to briefly provide what is to me perhaps the most grotesque and disturbing example of this tendency, which has come up outside the city where I now live, Bangalore. While I was, so, if you can see this Shankara Agrahara, which promotes itself as the world's largest exclusive Brahmin community layout, has the blessings of the Pejar Mat Swamiji in Udupi. And while I was preparing for this lecture, I saw that Tamil Nadu also has a similar Shankara township for, as it euphemistically puts it, the spiritually inclined. And I'll just pass through some of the models of homes that are promised to the inhabitants of this space, which promises to recreate in all its fullness the Brahmin Agraharam. No word is mentioned of who enables this and who maintains this, and how this purity is to be actually lived. But in any case, this is what is actually promised. And as you can see, there is a God's eye view of the Shankara Agraharam, which is sort of spelling out an Om here as well. And as I said, I discovered just before while I was preparing for this lecture, that Tamil Nadu has a similar proposal as well of a Shankara township meant here for the spiritually inclined. So it's a slight euphemism, but nothing really that different. But I would not like to end on a note that suggests some monocausal explanation for the predicaments related to our thinking about cities, which I'm sure will simply anger our architectural students, if there are any amongst those who are listening in today. Instead, let me turn, at the risk of precisely indulging in the flights of fantasy that are so vital to our times, though not necessarily approved of by historians who are more attached to the material traces, to the dust of the archive, so to speak. And I count myself amongst them. I do privilege the dust of the archive. Let me turn to a literary text that has been an inspiration to many and to me for a very long while. At the end of Marco Polo's magical conducted tour through 55 cities, with which he has mesmerized the great Kublai Khan, I'm referring to that luminous text, Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. It is a troubled great Khan who asks Marco Polo about those, quote, promised lands visited in thoughts, but not yet discovered or founded. To which Marco Polo offers a very insightful response. He says, and I quote, "The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what we already have. The inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are no inferno. Then make them endure, give them space." I'd like to repeat that sentence. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are no inferno. Then make them endure, give them space. This then is the task of the historian and the social theorist of our times. So I would like to end this by asking whether the archival silence or historical absence with which I began talking can be ended by asking a different set of questions, and what those moments are that can give us a glimpse, however brief, of what can and should be made to endure, for the future of humanity is at stake. So, what is it that we can find in the midst of this inferno that we can ensure endures, to give them space? I take 2 or 3 random examples from very mundane, but I think very profoundly meaningful moments. And I need not emphasize here that these are extremely subjective and personal choices. But if the point of turning to these examples from the past is to destabilize the present, to challenge and critique those structures and institutions that have been naturalized, that have been legitimized on the basis of old, comfortable worlds, then in these dissolutions, which I'm going to present one or two examples of, there are possibly new beginnings. The first, and this might, may even amuse some of you, is the odd even scheme that was introduced in Delhi in January 2016, repeated in 2017, and again in 2018. Now, there was a certain enforced abstinence of the usage of cars, of course. And at first, I have to say, I observed that in 2016, it was even strongly resented. Then in subsequent years, it was reluctantly complied with. And finally, I can say that I noticed people were actually welcoming it because it called forth ideas of cooperation in the form of pooling arrangements. It called for certain forms of abstinence from making unnecessary trips. It called for certain kinds of restraint, of course, resulted in relative cleanliness and declogging of the roads of the city. And finally, as I said, it also encouraged active public participation in its enforcement. So that's a rather, that's a very slender, small example that I'm giving of something that seemed to actually provide the glimpse of another urban order. The other two examples that I'm going to cite are actually of organized events which suddenly reveal the city for a completely different set of values and interests. The first of these that I refer to is the Kochi Biennale, which has been organized every 2 years in the city of Kochi, which, as you know, especially Fort Kochi, is actually a very decaying neighborhood part of the city, which has today been transformed through this art event, which animates the city, which recycles old buildings, which produces, as it were, economic vibrancy of a kind that had not been seen there for a while, and which importantly brings, art production to a very different kind of audience. In that sense, it also breaches the boundaries between art production and consumption, between elite audiences and so on and so forth, because of course it was an event in which the public and the very ordinary middle-class public, which was very much a participating element in these events organized in Kochi over a period of 3 or 4 months. So what is being reforged, remade there is not just the space of the city and the kinds of new values and virtues that are brought into play, but also the fact that there is active public participation in art worlds, which had hitherto remained somewhat confined to certain kinds of elite enclaves. The third example that I provide is something similar, but from another city, and that is Pujo in Calcutta, where you have the extraordinary sort of interface between publics and certain kinds of arts and aesthetics. And even though Calcutta is actually a very, very densely populated city, in that period, the parks and open spaces, which come in really homeopathic doses, as you know, in a city like Calcutta, are put to extraordinary use in producing spectacular things of beauty. What one is struck by during this Pujo event is, of course, the extraordinarily amiable crowds that throng these Pujo Pandas, which sort of recasts ideas of sharing. Above all, what is really wonderful is the safety of women in the city at all hours of the day and night. Loitering is actually encouraged at this time. It is a time, moreover, when this hardy stereotype about Bengali distaste for labor is turned on its head, because it is really the most passionate and laborious piety that can produce such magnificent, thought-provoking and enchanting visual pleasures. And so I give these very disparate and very different examples from 3 cities in India, very momentary kinds of examples, in order to talk about those moments which generate, as it were, new kinds and unexpected kinds of civic virtues, which I feel may be the kinds of things that we ought to nurture and see whether they can actually endure more than in this episodic fashion. This archive of discontinuous, uneven, sporadic, and temporally limited events and processes will not share the grandeur of the dreams of those 19th century and early 20th century forebears and their historic plans, that I have discussed so far, but it will be a very useful prompt to memory, as all archives should be. And we all know how urgent that prompt is in our times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. That was a wonderful presentation today. From Charles Fourier to 5 major points that you have talked about, it is indeed very, very fascinating, because especially your 3rd point and your 4th point, the 3rd point that focuses on necessities of beauty, and the 4th that was about, the hierarchy that you have talked about of gender. It's very, very interesting. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation that we had. And of course, we will be taking in questions that has come in the chat box. And if you want, I can read them out to you so that you can answer them. Thank you.
Yes, please do, because I can't see the chat box.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Yes. Can you please read the questions?
Minnie, are you there? Have we lost you? Minnie? Maybe her call has dropped. Shall I start with the questions till Minnie comes in?
Sure.
Yeah, this is from Mohammed Saeed. The question, can we say that Indus Valley cities were utopian because of their town planning, drainage system, and other features?
I don't think so. I'm actually using that term to refer to a very specific moment when there was a reaction to the unplanned Victorian city, and where people felt compelled, as it were, to imagine cities completely anew. So in that sense, I would say, all the existing types of cities in the Indian subcontinent are not necessarily utopian imaginings, even if they were perfectly planned. And we don't know much. We don't know more than what we know from the physical infrastructure of places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. We must remember that while urbanism and the city form have been known for well over 55 centuries, it really was the industrial city that marked a very, very specific break with ways of being in the city previous to this. So there is something very remarkable, new, unprecedented, and something from which there is no return after the onset of industrial capitalism. So no, my response would be to say those are not necessarily utopic spaces, even if they may be rather well planned. We are talking really about new imaginations arising out of the grotesque inequalities of the Victorian industrial city.
The next one is from Blessing Joseph. How has the idea of a city or spaces been perceived in the Indian subcontinent throughout history? How far has this perception been showcased in the construction of the present-day metropolis cities?
Those are both very, very large questions. I mean, there is a whole library of work on different Indian cities, which one would have to reference and probably have whole courses on. But there are various, broad kinds of, categories into which we can divide the cities as they have developed maybe in the last 400 or 500 years. The temple towns, of course, would be one such genre. The enormous port cities, which were enabled by British colonialism, are another specific sort of urban form that we are aware of. The administrative capitals are another kind of urban form with which we are now familiar. And of course, administrative capitals, particularly in the post-independence period, are a very specific and interesting urban form. We have also the wonderful case of Bombay, Ahmedabad, and Kanpur as examples of industrial cities, though they did not reach the kind of scale and size and importance that some of the Victorian industrial cities actually reached. So there are various types and genres of cities in the Indian subcontinent. It's impossible to talk about any one kind of city as representing in some ways Indianness, because there is a very vast, complex, and very checkered history of urbanism in the Indian subcontinent. That's my very brief and probably dissatisfactory response to that extremely large, important, but rather large question.
Thank you. This is a question again from Mohammed Saeed. Most often the state is setting up cities or control them. Whether the idea of people or state is actually represented in the life of a city.
Can you just repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Most often the state is setting up cities or control them. Whether the idea of people or state is actually represented in the life of a city.
No, actually, I don't agree that the state is what sets up cities. We don't have that history. There are very few instances of state actually setting up specific kinds of... Chandigarh, I suppose, would be one such example. But in fact, actually, many cities are organic growths which happen out of various kinds of activities that emerge within these spaces. Usually the activities associated with certain kinds of merchant groups or groups, productive groups, that is to say, towns that are set up because it is a center of weaving. There may be centers that are set up by the state which have purely military functions, such as the cantonments of the British. There would be certain cities like that. But by and large, we can say that many cities are actually organic growths. Usually, as the history of cities generally has shown us, around commercial trading and other kinds of activities before they become the centers of actual production and exchange and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily true that it's the state that determines urban form in all cases, or even in the majority of cases. I would say quite the opposite. It's actually less usual for the state to be engaged in the creation of urban settlements.
The next question is from Suraj B. Can the cities be designed to maximize civic virtues, that is, produce citizens, instead of profits, as done in contemporary apartment societies?
You know, I'm so glad that question has been asked, because there was another instance that I wanted to provide from our Indian experience of a certain kind. I won't say that it's exactly a utopian imagination, but there is a certain kind of new imagination that animates these settlements. And I'm referring here to the industrial township. If you read the documents on industrial townships, you will find that they especially in the 1950s, which was probably the moment of greatest optimism in that sense of what the Indian nation state, the independent Indian nation state could actually achieve. What was at the heart of these industrial townships was the hope that it would produce this new Indian citizen. And the effort that went into the design of the industrial townships to dissolve, as it were, the differences of language, the differences of region, the differences of ethnicity, and I would go so far as to say the differences of caste as well, were actually quite significant. And I think we have not sufficiently appreciated what the industrial township did in the 1950s and in the 1960s to produce, as it were, this ideal citizen. That is the language of those documents which are setting up these industrial cities. I come from a city which had industrial townships. I come from a city which has several industrial townships, ITI, BEL, BML, HAL, and so on and so forth. And it is very interesting to see that the language of these townships is actually saturated with the optimism of producing this new citizen. In fact, these townships are described in some documents as universities, as places of learning, because what is being learned is precisely what you said, new civic virtues and ways in which you can be a patriotic producer. So, this is all encouraging people to actually produce for the nation. And this is very much something that the state at this moment, the Nehruvian nation state at its glorious best, is interested in.
Next question is from Joseph. How do you look at the changes in city plans and architecture in relation to the dominant ideologies of the last 2 centuries?
That is again a rather large question, and I don't know if you're referring only to the Indian setting or worldwide. It's really a very, very large question that you have asked, because there is no one type of city plan or architecture that we are talking about. There are very many different kinds of settings and many different trajectories that were traced. Some in response to, I've discussed this at length today, I think, some in response to the problems of industrialization, but there were other kinds of city designs that emerged out of anxiety and concern about political insurrection. The city of Paris, for instance, was completely recast in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, to become what it has become today, as a consequence of this extraordinary anxiety and concern about political insurrection, the insurrectionary mob. So the space of that city was completely redrawn in order to enable greater surveillance of the mobs and to reduce revolutionary activity in the city of Paris, because it had repeatedly seen revolutions, especially after the French Revolution itself, but also in 1815, 1830, 1848, and so on. So each wave of revolutions is actually causing greater and greater anxiety amongst the political leaders, and this is leading to a reinscription of space. So there are various kinds of trajectories which would be too large to try and answer in the space of just a few minutes, but I've just given you one example of the kinds of plans that were put in place as a consequence of an anxiety of a very specific kind, in addition to, of course, what I've spoken about today in response to the industrial city of industrial capitalism.
This one is from Rennie Thomas. Thoroughly enjoyed the lecture, Professor Janaki Nair. I'm curious to know about the place of gods and religion in these utopias. Did religion play any role in either designing these utopias or as an insight of these utopias? Especially curious to know about the European examples you have discussed.
That's a very nice question, and thank you for raising it, because actually one of the interesting things about these examples that I have provided is that they were actually, I won't say anti, but they were certainly non-religious. There is a certain kind of spirituality that is called into place, but the spirituality to which one is referring is, of course, a certain kind of bonding with nature, a certain kind of respect for nature, rather than subordinating nature to human control and so on and so forth. But there is actually, that is a very interesting thing. There are religious utopian communities as well, which I have not discussed at all. But there is, at least in these examples that I provided, no specific reference to the needs and demands of religion that have been accommodated in these designs and spaces. In fact, some of these people were even disliked for the fact that they did not take into account the space of religion. But now that you've drawn my attention to it, I will have to go back and see exactly what the attitude to religion was. Whatever documents I have read do not seem to suggest that there was any sort of direct engagement with the needs of people for a space for reflection. There are of course halls for reflection, gathering for peaceful activities and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure whether we would then characterize those as religious activities. Perhaps even places for worship, but not necessarily designated or rather sectarian kinds of forms of worship. So, however, here I'm not going to go further than this, because your question prompts me to go back to some of these materials to actually find out the answer, the correct, or rather the fuller answer to the question that you have raised.
The next is from Tapati Guha Thakurta. Now that the idea of a return to nature and life in an idyllic green landscape is a dream sold to the rich and affluent of cities, we must also consider the way architects and urban activists are trying to conserve old, congested and dense lived spaces of historic cities. Can crowd density, old, crumbling neighborhoods and public communitarian life within the city be recovered as a value and necessity in itself? Can we decentralize the importance of beauty and open spaces?
Thank you for that lovely question, and it really does set me thinking. I think you're absolutely correct. We don't have, I presume here you are talking about the subcontinent, because actually the preservation of the denser medieval portions of cities, etc., is happening rather well in places like, for example, Western Europe. We do not have respect for those urban traditions in our Indian setting. I think the relentless logic of urban construction in India today is definitely one that privileges or sells, space by the square foot rather than giving any attention to historic value. So there is definitely something that needs to be thought about. At the same time, you're right. In terms of living spaces, there is an emphasis, and there has been an emphasis, perhaps an overemphasis, on the necessity and importance of open fields and open areas and gardens, parks and spaces, which are of course only meeting the demands of very, very small and specific sections of the Indian population. But if I can counter your question with another kind of thought, because what I have found when one goes on these tours of the denser neighborhoods, most recently or denser neighborhoods of Delhi, but I have done this in Bangalore too, is the complete lack of connect between people who actually reside in these spaces for the historic value of those spaces. To the extent that there is interest in preservation, renovation, creation, giving value, as you said, to these kinds of historic spaces, most of it is coming from, I would say, outside. That is to say, from conservationist historians, people who are interested in retaining and preserving this history. It has not necessarily come from people who are actually living in these spaces, unless it's a space which is of some productive value. I'm now speaking of the Bangalore Old City area, where there is a large number of pit looms and where there is, activity associated with the artificial silk industry, which gives value to those spaces in their inherited sense. But that's not because they're necessarily interested in that history. It's because it continues to have commercial importance and value to the present day. The minute that commercial importance and value in those existing forms declines, I don't think we'll see an interest in even preserving those kinds of spaces. So you can still, in the old city of Bangalore, hear the clack of pit looms and so on and so forth, and see those structures and so on and so forth. They are preserved by people living there, but that is because they have no other options. The minute they have some other option of turning that into more productive real estate, I don't think we will see the same kind of value being attached to actually residing in those spaces. So there is something about the necessity of doing that, but usually that impetus has come from outside. It has come from historians, it's come from conservationists, from societies that are interested in heritage and so on, not necessarily from people who are actually residing in these spaces. I don't know how we will produce that interest. I really don't know how, because it seems like a luxury to be able to tell people who are living in these tiny spaces and who have forged a certain kind of way of living in these tiny spaces, that these are to be valued for other reasons than commercial ones.
Thank you. The next one is from Givargis AM. With reference to your formulation of the utopian city, how would you annotate the neoliberal incarnation, the smart city? Government policy documents invoke the smart city in utopian terms. Is this a hegemonic model that blocks imagination, to use your phrase?
That's so interesting you said this, because actually that is one of the slides that I dropped from this presentation. I was actually going to show you the example of Dholera, because of course it is described as a utopian space, because it is, of course, being, as it were, built from scratch, and it's being designed as the smart city. All the language that is being used to describe the facilities that the city offers are drawn from things like utopia, but that's a very superficial kind of connection that is being drawn. There is rather wonderful work being done on Dholera by scholars, geographers like Ayana Datta, for example, and they have shown not only the very sort of exploitative ways in which land has been taken over for the creation of these spaces, but the very deliberately skewed kinds of priorities of these spaces in enabling certain kinds of activities, which are, of course, touted and promoted as the most important kinds of activities in a city like this. The fate of the city is yet to be known, but there are many, the idea of the smart city has actually been diluted somewhat over the past 10 years or so. So what you have now are actually smart city projects. You don't have smart cities per se. You don't have entire smart cities like you have in Dholera. So this idea has, in some ways, this vast organism called the Indian city has actually managed to subvert even the logic of those strips which are going to enter into some of the older cities, which are known as smart cities, because they are actually known as now as smart city projects. They're not necessary. And you can see that when a public utility arrives in any Indian city, it is like a natural disaster. So there's nothing smart about it, although that is the term that is used to describe these locations and these facilities that are enabled by these developments. But you are right, there is a great deal of emphasis on creating these idealized kinds of systems and structures for enabling certain kinds of immaterial labor to be performed in these spaces. The belief is a rather sort of idealized belief, I won't use the word utopian, that these systems and infrastructures will run better because they have been in some ways made amenable to systems of surveillance which have been put in place in these so-called smart cities. But there is no guarantee that this kind of thing will actually happen. See, I'll answer this question a little differently by saying all the kinds of experiments with enclaved development of any kind, whether it is a space like Chandigarh or a space like the reincarnation of Bhubaneswar and so on and so forth, are doomed to fail because we are living in a country that has this vast hinterland. We do not have the luxury like Singapore of being isolated on an island and being able to control migration, etc., through laws of international migration. We are a country with a large hinterland, and so any kind of enclaved planning is doomed to fail. That's what I would say. And Chandigarh is a good example of it. It was heroic in its conception. But of course, there are many things that happened that have undermined its initial importance. And I would say the same is true of Dholera. So, you cannot have a completely, unless it's going to be a completely walled, almost like a medieval European town, a walled space into which certain kinds of people will simply not be allowed, which has so far, thankfully, not yet been put in place in the cities of India, although there have been occasional demands for that kind of constraint and restriction being placed on migration into the cities off and on. It's been there since the 1960s, that kind of demand. So it's a very odd thing to say, but I think the very nature of our hinterland and the fact that you cannot have these enclave developments ensures that something like Dholera may actually come to grief, or at least may not live up to its promise, because there are too many other kinds of factors that are going to impinge on a space like this, as long as it is an enclave space.
Thank you. The next one is from Anasuya Chatterjee. Thank you, Professor Nair. I would be keen to know if one could view efforts to create spaces of conviviality to negotiate diversity in urban spaces in contemporary European cities as modern utopia / utopian imagination.
I don't know if I fully got that. Are you saying creation of spaces on the lines of what is happening in Western cities? Is that what your question was? I'm not sure what your question was, actually.
Do you want me to go over there again?
Can you just repeat that?
Yes. I would be keen to know if one could view efforts to create spaces of conviviality to negotiate diversity in urban spaces in contemporary European cities as modern utopias / utopian imagination.
To be frank, I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to, the spaces of conviviality. Are you saying they are things that should be thought about, or they already exist? And whether I would certainly not call them utopic spaces, not at all. I think when we are speaking of the utopian imagination, as I have done in most of my talk, I am referring to very specific ways of understanding space in order to produce new human beings. Now, encouraging conviviality, while it's of course a very laudable goal, is not necessarily something which is, producing new kinds of human beings, producing greater, well-being of the kind that requires you to redistribute, commodities, services, and so on and so forth within the space of the city. So I'm not sure that simply having certain kinds of arrangements within cities for greater meeting and for enjoyment and so on and so forth is necessarily something that can be categorized as utopian. I'm using it, therefore, in a rather narrow and very specific sense to refer to this wholesale transformation of spaces for generating completely new kinds of social relationships and so on. I don't know if you're referring to any specific example, because that would, of course, certainly help in answering the question. But as a general fact, I would not say that they are necessarily utopian.
There are two comments in the chat box. Since you can't see the chat box, I'll just read it out. One is from Tapati Guha Thakurta. Thank you for bringing the Durga Puja example in. And the second is from Sanal Mohan. Great presentation, wonderful listening to Professor Janaki Nair and learning from her.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
there are questions?
Yes. Then the next question is from Sandhya Devishan Nambiar. Thank you for the lecture, Professor Nair. I was wondering if we could read historical sentiment with respect to the city and the outsiders to it. This is related to questions of civilization and virtuous belonging, of course. But here I want to bring in the desire to move to live in utopian landscapes, which are linked to historical antagonisms, such as in Kashmir today. How does public emotion operate together with the kind of publics promised by the future city?
Yeah, it's also a rather large question, but is it? Let me see if I've understood some of it correctly. I think the question seems to be that it seems to be asking about the promotion of certain spaces in a country like India, and most recently, of course, the promotion of places like Kashmir as a place to which all Indians can now migrate for the purchase of real estate. Whether that's a promise of something utopic. You know, I hope I've understood you correctly. It was rather a large kind of question. But to the extent that we are talking about certain kinds of specific spaces and amenities being offered for sale, for acquisition, and for private consumption, I don't think we are necessarily talking of the utopian space, because as you know from all the examples that I gave, with the possible exception of Corbusier and to some extent also Frank Lloyd Wright, we have ideals of communitarianism which undermine the idea of private property ownership. So I would say intrinsic to some of these utopian ideals is an ideal of shared resources. Even if it is like in the Ibn Isa Howard example, I think there is also a space for private ownership, but there is also community ownership of many other kinds of resources. So there is definitely an attempt to minimize the place played by the market in determining your relationship to space, to try and reduce, as it were, the more exploitative relations between, say, for instance, landlord and tenant. That was definitely one of the things that was attempted to be recast in all those dreams that I described. And definitely there was an attempt to also reconstitute private property for the greater good of people within that community, which would have meant, of course, communal ownership. I gave specifically the example of Ebenezer Howard, who pointed this out. There is plenty of beauty in the countryside and so on and so forth, but it has already been privatized and should be in some ways made more publicly available. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, because I don't think, you see, there is utopia, and then there is the language of utopia which has been usurped by the market. So every what do you call it, gated community, or every specific sort of private building settlement definitely tries to use the language of this rural idyll and, you know, the setting which is in some ways removed from urbanism. That's why I use that term. You know, it's almost anti-urban, if you like. It is trying to, in some ways, negate the reality of the Indian city in the kinds of facilities, amenities, and so on and so forth that it offers. This is completely not at all what some of these utopian thinkers had in mind. They were thinking in terms of a much more widely shared set of resources for different sections of society, not just the elites. Whereas, of course, most of the examples that have been brought up in the questions have to do with the interests and demands of the elites.
Jinesh, Shidas, Shinoy, and Suraj, thank you. Thanks you for your excellent lecture. The next question is from Edgar de Mello. Most redevelopments of more central parts of cities have displaced the poor with the affluent. Lower East Side, New York, Ahmedabad, Sabarmati, Promenade, Amsterdam, and so on. I call it the Robert Moses effect. Is there another way?
I think the part of this question also came up in the question raised by Tapti Guha Thakurta. about old and decaying parts of the city, which have been maintained, renovated, restored, etc., only through a process of gentrification. And I think that is what Edgar is referring to. He's absolutely correct when he says that to the extent that some of these older parts of the city are retained, restored, renovated, etc., it has a lot to do with gentrification. So original populations have been evicted, and there have been processes by which, again, a certain kind of elite has taken over these. We see this many examples, Delhi, House Caste Village, in Bangalore, the Shule area, and so on and so forth. So many kinds of instances, even in our own setting, of gentrification. Is there a solution to this? I do not see a solution that does not involve the state. If the state is interested in preservation, conservation of these areas for their heritage and historic value, which I very much doubt, I don't think that we are seeing that even something as significant and important as the Central Vista in Delhi is being reconstituted by the state to satisfy its own vanities. So I do not see much hope in what I'm proposing, but nothing short of state intervention to check the activities of the market, which relentlessly translates all such property into their value as per square foot, as it were, is that's the only hope. That if there is some kind of state intervention that prevents the transaction of these spaces within the market to people who want to, use it for various other kinds of purposes, commercial purposes and so on. Unless that area has some meaning and value to the local population itself. I did give you the example of the central parts of Bangalore, which has as yet, I don't think, been gentrified. The old city still remains to some extent intact because there are inhabitants who have found it useful and valuable to continue their activities, their traditions, if you like, without disturbance. But that is because it is still economically viable. The minute it becomes economically unviable, we will see that a similar fate awaits that area as well. So I do not see a way out of this that does not involve state intervention.
Yeah, the last question is from Reshma Bharadwaj. You talked with the transitory ephemeral emergence of a utopian sensibility, transforming the otherwise monotonous, tedious city space, like in Durga Puja. Can the imaginations of the marginalized dwellers in the city bring such momentary transformations of the built spaces? And how would a historian gain insight into such utopian imaginations of the marginalized?
That's a very interesting question, but a difficult one to answer, because my limited knowledge of events that happen within cities and so on and so forth does not include an example of a subaltern utopian imagination that is making its impact even temporarily on the city. I would be the first to be corrected if I can be provided with these examples, but I am not personally myself aware of. There are these temporary occupations of city space by festivities of a more subaltern kind, whether they are religious festivities, whether they are funeral processions, whether they are political events. There are all kinds of occupation of street space at different times, and we know how tedious also this can become in terms of people's otherwise normal activities. So I do not know of a comparable experience to puja in Calcutta that actually transforms city space from below in a way that would involve or include vast numbers of the population. I'm not aware of any such example. maybe we can take the example of Ganesh Utsav as something that has a more plebeian origin, and also similarly occupies the spaces of the city of Bombay, for example, overlaid with political and other kinds of intent. But I'm not sure whether it achieves, because I think, though I have not looked at the Ganesh Utsav case as closely, I think that that would be a very different set of circumstances. A more, I would say, go so far as say perhaps even more masculinist kind of celebration, the Ganesh Utsav, compared with, say, the Durga Puja, and it's there's a certain kind of hyper-masculinity that is on display even in places like Bombay. But this is just, I'm talking very superficially now. I do no deep knowledge of that particular example that I'm providing. But that could be one way of thinking about it. But I would welcome these examples to perhaps to be able to evaluate what promise they hold of offering something that actually is possible to take up as a more enduring kind of as a more enduring value, so that it doesn't remain just ephemeral, transitory, and temporary.
That was the last question. Minnie, are you here? Are you back? Can you take over? Minnie? I guess she's still not back. The call
Yeah,
has-
I could, thank you so much for this presentation. I think, Shiba, I do have some problem with this mic. So can you, I'm giving it back to you. Okay, you take over.
Thank you, Minnie. That was a wonderful session. That is really brilliant to have you here. And in the discussions, we had more to hear of what you had to say. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all participants for being here today. We're also glad that we could also have your dog in the present. I think that's how spaces get refigured again.
I have to say, this was my first Zoom lecture. So, I'm doing some classes online, but it's not the same thing. So I thank you for this opportunity, and also I do apologize for that interruption.
No, that is fine. It's part of life.
These are some of the drawbacks of being at home, I suppose. This is some of the But thank you very much. That was a very lively session. Thank you, all those of you who raised questions, very thoughtful questions, which have made me also rethink some of the things that I have said, and will force me to go back to the material to be able to answer them more fully. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.